Good morning. The House Armed Services Committee meets today to receive testimony on the President's decision to commit armed forces in an international effort to shield Libya's civilian population from the fury of a repressive tyrant. I commend our fighting forces for manning the wall between freedom and tyranny, and I honor their bravery. But I have concerns about our objectives in Libya, our contribution to meeting those goals, and the length of America's commitment to what could be a prolonged conflict. Secretary Gates himself, when asked if the U.S. had vital interests in Libya, said no, but we have interests in the region. The United States has interests in all regions of the globe, but I'm curious what the criteria are for military intervention. History has demonstrated that an entrenched enemy like the Libyan regime can be resilient to air power. If Gaddafi does not face an imminent military defeat or refuses to abdicate, it seems that NATO could be expected to support a decade-long no-fly zone enforcement like the one over Iraq in the 90s. With Iraq and Afghanistan already occupying a considerable share of American resources, I sincerely hope that this is not the start of a third elongated conflict, especially in a region where we have other more discernible strategic interests. With America's fighting men and women in harm's way, it is not my intention to second-guess or undermine the administration's authority, but I would like an explanation of the nature of this threat and how American interests will be advanced through the use of military power. Fortunately, we have two witnesses who I hope will bring clarity to these ambiguities. Defense Secretary Robert Gates and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, thank you for taking the time to attend this open session today. Mr. Secretary, I understand how busy you've been. I know you've traveled a lot. I know that you've got tremendous burdens on you and also you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us here today, and that's very important. On a final note, I'd like to remind members of the public who are with us today that I will tolerate no disruption to this proceeding. This is a serious matter. Members of this committee and the American public deserve to hear what our witnesses have to say. I'll ask the Capitol Police to remove anyone who creates a disturbance. Thank you. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, thank you for being here today. I think the most important thing in this hearing is to answer the questions of where we go from here, what the situation on the ground in Libya is, and what you see the level of U.S. involvement from this point forward. It's obviously a very uncertain situation, and there will be no guarantees, no set timetables. But as members in Congress, the more information we get on your best estimate of what our commitment is going to be, for how long, and what's going to be involved, and what our goals are, the better off we're going to be able to explain it to our constituents. I also think it's important in the hearing today to flesh out a little bit the criteria for our intervention. Many have asked the question, why Libya, but not some of the other places that have civil wars or disruptions going on. I think I have some of the answers for that, but I think it's very important to explain to the American people that this is not an open-ended commitment from the United States that we will dive in and get involved in any civil war any time. I do believe that there were a unique set of circumstances in Libya that warranted this action, but I think it's incredibly important that we explain what that unique set of circumstances was to let the American people know that this is not something we're going to be doing in a great number of places. I think here we had a clear situation where our unique assets and ability could, at least in the short term, stop a humanitarian disaster. Colonel Gaddafi was rolling back the rebellion and killing many civilians, and there was every reason to believe that he would continue to do that, and they were unable to defend themselves. We had a unique situation also in that the international community came together in support of action against Colonel Gaddafi. The United Nations, the Arab League, NATO, we had a broad base of support. I think that's important not just because it gives us that support, gives us cover, if you will, for our actions, but it's important because it also made it more likely that we could succeed in those actions. And that's one of the most important criteria that I don't think has been talked about enough. You can look at situations in the past, like in Rwanda, or even now in Syria, in Bahrain, in Yemen, and see a humanitarian crisis developing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the military ability to go in there and succeed in stopping that from happening and making things better instead of worse. In Libya, I think we did have that opportunity because of the international support, because of the assets that we could bring to bear, and because of the fact that we had clear targets in Libya to stop Colonel Gaddafi from rolling back the rebellion, at least temporarily. And to have that opportunity was one that we should have taken. I think everyone should be mindful of the fact that if we had not acted, not only would this have happened, not only would thousands of civilians in Libya have been killed, but the United States of America, in the eyes of much of the world, would have been blamed for that, because they would have seen clearly that we had the chance to stop it and chose not to. As someone who has worked extensively on counterterrorism policy and dealing with al-Qaeda, that would have been a crushing blow to us, to once again make it look like the United States did not care about protecting those in the Muslim world who face the violence of despots. So I think we have to factor that in as well. But going forward, we do need to know what comes next, because for the fact that we had the ability to act a week ago doesn't mean that we're going to be able to continue to be successful. We really want to know what the commitment is going to be, and I share the Chairman's concerns. Given our commitments in Afghanistan and Iraq, how long can we sustain this, and where is this going? So we look forward to your comments, we look forward to your further explanations, and I thank the Chairman for the time.
Be just a couple of things, Mr. Secretary, if you could hold till we have the cameras, give them an opportunity to leave. Now, the Secretary has a hard end time today at 12:30, so I will really push to keep us in the 5 minutes. If you have 5 minute, excuse me, 11:30. What time did I say? No, 11:30. Excuse me. And I will hold the 5 minutes. If you want to take 5 minutes answering your question, they will answer it in the record. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the ongoing international military operations in Libya. I would start by providing some context on how we got to this point, at least from my perspective. In the space of about 2 months, the world has watched an extraordinary story unfold in the Middle East. The turbulence being experienced by virtually every country in the region presents both perils and promise for the United States, as stability and progress in this part of the world is a vital national interest. This administration's approach has been guided by a core set of principles that President Obama articulated in February: opposing violence, standing for universal values, and speaking out on the need for political change and reform. At the same time, we have recognized that each country in the region faces a unique set of circumstances, and that many of the countries affected are critical security partners in the face of common challenges like al-Qaeda and Iran. In the case of Libya, our government, our allies, and our partners in the region watched with alarm as the regime of Muammar Gaddafi responded to legitimate protests with brutal suppression and a military campaign against his own people. With Colonel Gaddafi's forces on the verge of taking Benghazi, we face the very real prospect of significant civilian casualties and hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing to Egypt, potentially destabilizing that important country even as it is undergoing its own difficult transition. Once the Arab League and Gulf Cooperation Council called on Gaddafi to cease his attacks, and our European allies expressed a willingness to commit real military resources, it became apparent that the time and conditions were right for international military action. The goal of Operation Odyssey Dawn, launched on March 19th, was limited in scope and scale. The coalition quickly achieved its first military objective by effectively grounding Colonel Gaddafi's Air Force and neutralizing his air defenses. During this first phase, the U.S. military provided the preponderance of military assets and firepower, as well as logistical support and overall command and control. Responsibility for leading and conducting this mission, now called Operation Unified Protector, has shifted to an integrated NATO command. Going forward, the U.S. military will provide the capabilities that others cannot provide either in kind or in scale, such as electronic attack, aerial refueling, lift, search and rescue, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance support. Accordingly, we will in coming days significantly ramp down our commitment of other military capabilities and resources in this operation. The NATO-led mission, like its predecessor, is a limited one. It will maintain pressure on Gaddafi's remaining forces to prevent attacks on civilians, enforce the no-fly zone and arms embargo, and provide humanitarian relief. There will be no American boots on the ground in Libya. Deposing the Gaddafi regime, as welcome as that eventuality would be, is not part of the military mission. In my view, the removal of Colonel Gaddafi will likely be achieved over time through political and economic measures and by his own people. However, this NATO-led operation can degrade Gaddafi's military capacity to the point where he and those around him will be forced into a very different set of choices and behaviors in the future. In closing, as I have said many times before, the security and prosperity of the United States is linked to the security and prosperity of the broader Middle East. I believe it was in America's national interest, as part of a multilateral coalition with broad international support, to prevent a humanitarian crisis in eastern Libya that could have destabilized the entire region at a delicate time. And it continues to be in our national interest to prevent Gaddafi from visiting further depredations on his own people, destabilizing his neighbors, and setting back progress the people of the Middle East have made in recent weeks. Mr. Chairman, I know you and your colleagues have many questions, so I will now ask Admiral Mullen to comment. As always, my thanks to this committee for all the support you have provided to our military over the years.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of this committee. I share the Secretary's gratitude for the opportunity to talk to you about coalition operations in support of the Libyan people. Let me start with a brief assessment of where we are today and then leave you with some impressions. As of early this morning, NATO assumed command of the entire military mission over Libya. There are more than 20 nations contributing to this operation in all manner of ways, some public, some not so public. Contributions range across the board, from active participation in strike operations to financial aid and assistance for humanitarian efforts. We are joined in this endeavor by several Arab countries who have, despite domestic challenges of their own, chosen to come to the aid of the Libyan people. I hope they do so knowing that the United States and the international community remain grateful for their experience and their leadership, but also knowing that no one military, no one nation can or should take on a mission of this nature alone. This coalition we have forged in record time, mind you, is not only a coalition of the willing, it is a coalition of the able, with each nation bringing to the effort what they can in terms of knowledge and skill to tackle a very fast-moving, complex humanitarian crisis. 25 warships patrol off the coast of Libya today, including 2 Allied aircraft carriers, France's Charles de Gaulle and Italy's Garibaldi, each with combat aircraft embarked. There are also in those waters destroyers and frigates, patrol boats, oilers, and submarines. There's even a U.S. amphibious ready group centered around the USS Kearsarge. On these ships and at European bases ashore, the NATO commander from Canada, Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard, has at his disposal more than 220 aircraft of just about every size and stripe imaginable. With these pilots and these planes, he may operate freely throughout the Libyan airspace, around the clock, studying and gaining intelligence of regime ground force movement and intentions, striking targets of opportunity on little or no notice, and preventing Gaddafi from using his own air force to attack his own people. I would note that among these coalition aircraft are more than a dozen from Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Fighter pilots from Qatar have already flown more than 30 sorties in support of the no-fly zone mission. Indeed, in just the last 24 hours, U.S., NATO, and coalition aircraft flew some 204 sorties, 110 of which were strike-related, hitting fixed and mobile targets in the vicinity of Tripoli, Misrata, and Ajabiyah. We have such freedom of movement because we moved quickly in the early hours of the operation to render an effective regime air defenses and command and control. The first cruise missiles and strategic bombers struck late Saturday night, the 19th, Tripoli time. By mid-afternoon the next day, the no-fly zone was essentially in place. We have continued to strike Gaddafi's military capabilities where and when needed, and it's my expectation that under NATO leadership, that level of effort and focus will not diminish. What will diminish, as the Secretary said, is the level of U.S. participation in offensive operations as we turn our attention to providing our unique enabling capabilities. Mr. Chairman, I've been involved with allied and coalition operations of one kind or another for much of the last decade, from the Balkans to Iraq and Afghanistan. I cannot remember a time when so many nations mobilized so many forces so fast. The enemy wasn't just Gaddafi's military, it was also the clock as he marched on Benghazi, intent on brutalizing the people there. But we were ready. Before the ink was even dry on that UN resolution, there were planes and ships, pilots and sailors moving into position, ready to act. They were able to do that because we, and I mean the collective we, not just the United States, have invested in close relationships with one another, facilitated by nearby air and naval basing, and improved over time through annual exercises, personnel exchanges, actual combat experience, and mutual dialogue. Nobody is underestimating the scope of the challenge before us. Gaddafi still possesses superior military capability to those of the forces arrayed against him. He still shows every desire of retaking lost ground and, in fact, did so yesterday. He still wants Benghazi back and Ajabia. He still denies his own people food, water, electricity, and shelter. He threatens them on the streets of Misrata and Zintan. And he has made no secret of the fact that he will kill as many of them as he must to crush the rebellion. I will leave to our political leaders the task of debating the character of the mission we have been assigned, but I can assure you that your men and women in uniform will execute that mission, now in support of NATO, with the same professionalism and with which they have led that mission until today. Again, thank you for allowing me to be here, and thank you for your long-standing support of our men and women and their families.
Thank you very much. I was pleased that the President finally addressed the nation on Monday to explain his decision to introduce forces into Libya. He made his rationale quite clear. Utilizing U.S. warriors to protect civilians from a brutal dictator is a noble cause. But the President's strategy seems to consist of two mutually exclusive parts. The first is to protect Libya's civilians, which is now the responsibility of NATO forces. However, the President has also stated that Colonel Gaddafi must be removed from power. This is a political consideration and not part of the military mission. I'm concerned that such a mismatch is a strategy for stalemate. Moreover, the President went on to observe that until Gaddafi steps down from power, Libya will remain dangerous. That sounds like foreshadowing for an enduring military mission to protect the Libyan civilian population. Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen, how long do you anticipate our military mission will last? Under what circumstances is it permissible for Gaddafi to remain in power? If he does, will it be necessary for U.S. forces to remain engaged in Libya to protect civilians? If it is not permissible for Gaddafi to remain in power, why has the military mission been limited?
First, Mr. Chairman, you have characterized it correctly in the sense that the military mission is a limited one and does not include regime change. Personally, I felt strongly about that. We've tried regime change before, and sometimes it's worked and sometimes it's taken 10 years. And it does, as has been the case in Iraq, sometimes involve both enormous human and physical cost. So the idea here was basically to establish the military mission, as you said, was to establish the no-fly zone and protect the Libyan people. I believe one of the characteristics of protecting the Libyan people has in fact been our effort to degrade the Libyan military. This is something that after the initial Gulf War we actually did not do in Iraq. Even though we had a no-fly zone. We didn't keep attacking Saddam's military capabilities as we are doing in Libya. As both the Chairman and I have indicated, our role already has begun to recede. to the support roles that I indicated. We will not be taking an active part in the strike activities, and we believe that our allies can sustain this for some period of time. But I think that one thing that may make a difference in terms of how long it takes for this regime to change is the fact that we continue to degrade his military capabilities, and I think that may contribute to some cracking of the unity of his own military. But the bottom line is no one can predict for you how long it will take for that to happen. But I can tell you that the military mission and our now support role will remain limited as I've described it.
I would only add, Mr. Chairman, that echoing what the Secretary said about being able to predict how long, I just don't think that that can be done right now. We have actually fairly seriously degraded his military capabilities, his air defense capabilities, his command and control capabilities. We've attrited his overall forces at about the 20 to 25% level. That doesn't mean that he's about to break from a military standpoint, because that's just not the case. However, I do have great confidence in NATO's ability now in command, with the resources it has available, to be able to continue to attrit that capability and continue in the support role that the United States will to support that attrition. And then I think, for the long term, it is obviously, as others have said, there are lots of tools in the kit, and to bring that kind of pressure on him, which gets to the eventual overall policy objective of his leaving.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to agree with both your remarks on that. I think regime change by military force, by a foreign military force, comes with a very high cost and a lot of unpredictability. I think it's perfectly consistent to say we want Gaddafi to leave, but the cost of doing it with U.S. or even NATO boots on the ground is entirely too high, and we have to put pressure on him in other ways to drive him out. I think that is something that there's been some confusion about in the public, but I think it's a fairly consistent position. And certainly it does sometimes work, as we saw in the case of Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia. I did not think that was going to drive him out, but it did rather quickly. And if we can degrade the support for Gaddafi, degrade his military ability, I think that has a much better chance of succeeding in a clearer long-term path than any sort of military invasion. The question I want to ask is about the authority for doing this. I think there's also considerable consternation about that, particularly amongst my fellow members of Congress. What is the legal constitutional authority for the President and the military to have acted without prior congressional authorization? And I think there was a lot of misunderstanding about the history of that within Congress and within the media, for that matter. This is not unprecedented. There's been sort of a bipartisan feeling amongst both Democrat and Republican presidents that Article 2 gives them the authority to act militarily. It happened in Kosovo, as I referenced, but also in Panama and Grenada, and a number of other examples going back decades, if not over 100 years. But we also have the War Powers Act that is out there, that, as I understand it, it's been the position of every executive that is an unconstitutional infringement upon their Article 2 rights, and therefore they've not felt like they have to follow it. Certainly it wasn't followed again in the instances that I just mentioned. But if you could walk through your viewpoint on the authority, I think that would be very important for members of Congress, because I don't think that was adequately explained at the briefing yesterday, and I think that leaves a lot of members of Congress feeling like they've been completely left out, and that the law has not been followed. And I think that's a critical piece in building broader public and congressional support for any action going forward. So if you could talk a little bit about that, I think that would be helpful for us.
Well, first of all, this is not exactly my area of expertise, constitutional law. But I will say that But
if I could, I'm sorry,
I understand.
As you point, you've been there a long time. You've been through a lot of these decisions. I think you have something to say about it.
I was actually in the White House on the NSC staff when the War Powers Act was passed, and in the mid-1970s. And I think it is fair to say that there has been disagreement between the Congress and the President ever since then on what is required of him under the War Powers Act. President Obama is the 8th president I've worked for. 7 operated under the War Powers Act, and I would say that his compliance in terms of consultation and notification of the Congress has been consistent with the actions taken by all of his predecessors, both Republicans and Democrats, since the War Powers Act was passed. There was a consultation with the Congressional leadership before the military operations started on Friday before Saturday night. About half were present in the Situation Room. About half were on a telephone conference call. The written formal notification of the Congress took place. So this has been an area of contention between the executive and the legislative branches for better than 35 years now. But I think that the President's actions are completely consistent with those of his predecessors and with the executive branch's interpretation of the War Powers Act.
Thank you. The only thing I would add to that before yielding back is I do think, and this is not for your gentleman's benefit, this is more for the White House. You know, yes, the Friday before we launched the attack, we did have that consultation. I think in the future, in the days and even weeks as we built up to this, it would have been better for the White House to have began discussions with key Republican and Democratic leaders as we built up to this decision. I don't think that was done sufficiently, and I think that would have helped members of Congress be more supportive of the action once it eventually took place, understanding that was not your decision. I just think that would have been a critical issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Let me just add one sentence, and that is that the President actually did not make his final decision on what to do until Thursday night. And so having the Congress, having the leadership of the Congress in the very next day seemed to me was pretty prompt.
Right. No, and I get that. I guess what I was saying was that, you know, we do not feel that it should wait until the final decision is made. There were a lot of things being discussed in the weeks leading up to this. I mean, obviously, we'd gone to the UN in part to ask for the resolution that came down on Thursday. We knew it was coming. Even before the White House knows exactly what it's going to do, there is some benefit to bringing leadership in Congress into the discussion in terms of building support here. And I think that would have helped build more support in Congress if we felt we knew the thinking process leading up to that decision. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And again, that's one of the problems is consulting Congress before a decision is made versus just telling us what is going to happen is probably, I think, what the ranking member is referring to, and probably one of the things that would help the support in the Congress. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, I'd like you to take my first question, if you would, for the record, because I know that others will need to be involved in formulating an answer. Under what circumstances would the President request authorization from Congress for the use of military force in Libya? And second, sir, if not for Libya, under what circumstances would the President request authorization from Congress to use military force in general? Do you see the use of CIA and U.S. Special Forces in Libya as following the blueprint we used in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I can't speak to any CIA activities, but I will tell you that the President has been quite clear that in terms of the United States military, there will be no boots on the ground.
In Afghanistan, we went in to assist a well-organized resistance group, the Northern Alliance. We kind of took sides in a civil war and joined the side that was going to win anyhow. In Libya, the only opposition group in recent history is the LIFG, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, a radical faction that has been waging jihad against the Gaddafi regime. Following the 9/11 attacks against the United States, LIFG was banned worldwide by UN Resolution 1267 committee. It is my understanding that the LIFG is aligned with AIGM. And in a column earlier this month, New York Times, Thomas Friedman noted that Libya is not a nation. There isn't any loyalty to Libya. It is a collection of 140 different tribes, much more like Iraq. Sir, are we now aiding and abetting the same organizations that we are fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq?
Well, to be honest, other than a relative handful of leaders, we don't have much visibility into those who have risen against Gaddafi. But I think that, in a way, speaking of the quote-unquote opposition is a misnomer, because it is very disparate, it is very scattered, and probably each element has its own agenda. Each of these towns that rose up in the West and that where resistance has been quelled basically did so on their own, and you didn't see people going from one town to the next to share in the fight. And frankly, that's one of the problems that that those who have rebelled against Gaddafi are facing, is the lack of command and control and the lack of organization. So I would say there are multiple agendas, very disparate elements across the country engaged in this, and at this point we don't have a lot of visibility into those.
What visibility do we have? LIFG is, in fact, sir, a major component of the opposition?
I'm just not aware. I just don't know.
My next question, sir, I know the premise is debatable, but many people feel that that this is an unconstitutional and illegal war. But I think almost everybody agrees that the cost shouldn't be borne by taxpayers by increasing our $14 trillion debt or by raising taxes, and they shouldn't come out of the hide of DOD. That hide's pretty thin now, sir. That's why I introduced a bill that I know you're aware of that would make DOD FY11 accounts whole by requiring the President to provide Congress a list of specific recommendations of non-security discretionary appropriations rescissions for FY11 by July 2. This bill exempts FY11 spending for DOD as well as the Departments of Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs. Mr. Secretary, the legislation requires that you report to the President no later than June 1 with estimates for total FY11 expenses in Libya based upon expenses incurred through May 15, 2001. Is this a reasonable time frame for you to assist Congress in our effort to ensure that the capability of our armed forces fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq are not degraded by the President's unconstitutional and illegal war?
Well, first of all, I can tell you that our costs as of last Monday were about $550 million. And in the new support role that we assume today, we expect that the run rate, we estimate that the run rate will be about $40 million a month. So I can give you that information now.
Is this date a reasonable time for you to tell us what rescissions, what it will cost, so that we can find the President can find the rescissions?
Well, I'd have to consult with the White House and OMB on that.
Would you do that for the record, sir?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, and Admiral, thank you for being here. And we know you're working under very difficult circumstances. My question deals along the same lines as Mr. Bartlett's. We know that it's been difficult to continue to operate with the budget process tied up in a continuing resolution. So one of the concerns, well, two questions. One concern is we probably are going to get a request for a supplemental, which will include Libya, and if so, will that also include Afghanistan and Iraq for that? And the second question, there's a lot of concern that with the action now against Libya, that somehow we're going to have to readjust the commitment that we're making, particularly in Afghanistan. As you know, I represent Fort Bliss, and there are a number of people that have expressed concerns that we're going to somehow shift some of our assets into Libya. Can you address both the supplemental and any potential for having to shift resources from particularly Afghanistan?
We will not be shifting resources from Afghanistan. In fact, thanks to the cooperation of the Congress, we are just in the process of sending about $600 million worth of additional ISR to Afghanistan. And yesterday in a meeting, I approved coming forward with an effort to try and reprogram about another $400 million worth of ISR. So we will be adding ISR capability to Afghanistan, not taking it away, and we don't anticipate strike forces. There have been some electronic attack aircraft that have been moved from Iraq to the Middle East, but in a way that we felt did not present any risk to our operations in Iraq. In terms of how to pay for this, there is we are in the discussions with the White House right now on this and OMB. I share your and Mr. Bartlett's view that it would be very difficult for the Department to eat this cost out of the base budget. There is an overseas contingency operations bill here before the Congress, and my personal view, I haven't coordinated this with the White House or OMB, but I think we ought to be able to find a way to deal with this in the framework of that bill without adding to the top line number of that bill. I would add, though, just in terms of my interests as Secretary of Defense in keeping this operation limited, is the strain that we have on our military. And one of the things that people haven't talked much about, we have 19 ships and about 18,000 men and women in uniform helping on the Japanese relief. There are going to be some costs associated with that also that are going to have to be taken care of. So between these two operations, I would just make a final pitch for those who are contemplating deep cuts in the defense budget, looking around the world at the kinds of commitments that we have and the potential challenges that we have. I think it bears a very careful consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your work.
Thank you. Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary and Admiral Mullen. I must tell you that home for the last week that the American people are just so disenchanted, the people of the 3rd District, that the President seemed to say to Congress, you really aren't a factor in whether we do or do not. And I guess that can be debated, and I'm not trying to get into that. But I get so upset when I hear, and Mr. Secretary, I have great respect for you and enjoy seeing you and Secretary Clinton on the interviews this weekend. When you say that, we can't tell you when it's going to end. I understand that, but there again, we're going to be in Afghanistan for 4 or 5 more years, maybe 10, I don't know. But anyway, we're not a strong nation. We can't pay our own bills right now. I had 3 wives of Marines down in Camp Lejeune to call my office yesterday wondering about a shutdown. Their husbands are overseas in Afghanistan. They're worried about whether they're going to get a check. They got children at home, but that's not really where I want to go. But I just want to try to put it where my people see it in my district. This Gaddafi is absolutely evil, and yet we take the lead on everything. I don't know where the other countries are. Why in the world don't they take the lead on something? And yes, Admiral Mullen, this will be a question for you, and I got one for the Secretary in just 1 second. If we are now, NATO is in the lead, does that mean we can reduce our military involvement and reduce the spending of these Tomahawk missiles at $1 million apiece? That would be my question to you. And Mr. Secretary, under what circumstances, as it relates to the President's decision to go into Libya, this is piggybacking on what Mr. Bartlett was asking, but under what circumstances would you see that a President should come to Congress before he or she, at some point in the future, makes a decision like has been made about Libya, that the decision is, well, okay, Congress, we'll talk to your top leadership, we'll tell them what we're going to do, and yet to the people's house, there is no consultation at all. And I just think that the American people are just tired and fed up. So my question to you is, under what circumstances would you believe that the President should come to Congress and make a request for military use in Libya. Do you see any circumstances other than what's been done so far where a president, I'll take it away from Mr. Obama, but you are a leader of this nation, you will leave one day just like I will. When does the president understand that he's got a responsibility to inform Congress? Because truthfully, we have been left out in the cold on this one. So, Mr. Admiral, I've got my question to you, I believe. I've got a question to Mr. Secretary, if I made it clear enough, and if you would answer, I would appreciate it.
Mr. Jones, the short answer with respect to our commitment is yes, it will be significantly reduced, literally starting today. We actually went in fairly heavy early, but it was, and actually it was in great part at the request from a leadership standpoint of our allies in Europe originally. So you will see us come down fairly dramatically here over the next few days, and then sustained at a level of support in the areas the Secretary has mentioned. The other thing that I would just mention briefly in terms of confidence in NATO, I have sat in this same room over many years, and NATO has been very badly berated because they wouldn't lead, they wouldn't contribute forces, they wouldn't do things that we would want them to do, and we were carrying the load. In this case, it is actually the opposite. I mean, NATO has taken the lead, done so very rapidly, essentially set this, approved its own rules, if you will, and operational plans to execute this mission in record time. And NATO has evolved like many of us, but NATO has evolved in ways where they are really contributing significant amount of capability in all four aspects of this mission: no-fly zone, arms embargo, civilian protection, and humanitarian assistance. And I think they will continue to do that.
The answer to your question is better provided by individual presidents, Mr. Jones, because they all make their own judgments on these matters. I think, as you all are well aware, there has not been a formal congressional declaration of war, as far as I can recall, since World War II. There have been different kinds of resolutions, resolutions of support. Presidents have sought them sometimes. Congress has passed them without the request of presidents sometimes. As Secretary Clinton has said, we obviously would welcome an action by the Congress in support of what the President has done. That would obviously provide an opportunity for debate. But I think that it is the seeking of a resolution, such as even short of a declaration of war, depends very much on the specific circumstances involved. And just to give you an example, I was asked in the Senate in a hearing several years ago whether I thought the Congress, thought the President had an obligation to come to the Congress if he were to decide to use military action against Iran. And I said I thought so, because I think that the nature, scope, and duration of such a potential conflict would require it. But I think the bottom line answer to your question is that's a judgment call that each President needs to make.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary and Mr. Chairman. First, I hope you would convey to the men and women under your command how proud we are of them, how grateful and how supportive. Second, to each of you, but particularly you, Mr. Secretary, thank you for providing a very artful example of a combination of candor and duty at the same time. We appreciate and admire the way you conduct yourself. Mr. Secretary, if you came to us for your posture hearing in February of next year, and you reported to the committee that the strategic mission in Libya had been a success, not just the military side, but the entire strategic mission had been a success, what would that look like?
Well, I think a policy success would be the removal of the Gaddafi regime and at least the beginnings of the emergence of a more or less democratic government in Tripoli.
Admiral Mullen testified a few minutes ago that at present, I think I have this right, that the Gaddafi forces still maintain a military capability superior to that of the rebels. If that condition were to persist, if that condition were to persist, what's the next strategic move on the military side that would be necessary to achieve that success that you just outlined?
Well, I think I can speak with some confidence that the President has no additional military moves in mind beyond what he has already authorized, which is the support of the no-fly zone and the humanitarian mission. I think that what the opposition needs as much as anything right now is some training, some command and control, and some organization. It's pretty much a pickup ball game at this point. And as I got a question yesterday in one of the briefings, the truth is, in terms of providing that training, in terms of providing assistance to them, frankly, there are many countries that can do that. That's not a unique capability for the United States, and as far as I'm concerned, somebody else should do that.
I think the administration has outlined a strategy that essentially goes like this, that we'll use the military coalition to create the conditions under which economic and diplomatic and military efforts by the rebels can create success. There are two things that trouble many of us about this mission. The first is a constitutional issue about the way we made the decision to get here in the first place. That's really not your purview. The decision was made, and I think that's a discussion between the head of the executive branch and the Congress. The second thing that troubles a lot of us is that although we are hopeful that that strategy will succeed, that by setting those conditions we will achieve the result that you articulated and there will be a new government in Tripoli that looks something like a democracy. Our concern is, what if it doesn't succeed? Now, we don't want to speculate on failure because that's not a very smart thing to do. But I think there clearly is a concern that we need to have a plan B. And do you have any sense of what the plan B would be if this one doesn't work?
Well, I think keeping the pressure on Gaddafi has merit and is a worthy objective on its own. One of the concerns that I think weighed on the President and on all of us was that with his military power and his money, that Gaddafi's ability to disrupt the democratic transitions going on with both of his neighbors, Tunisia and Egypt, was considerable. And as his own people rose up against him and he began to suppress them, there were many foreign workers in Libya that felt themselves at risk. And so there are over 1 million Egyptians, for example, in Libya. And which is one reason why the Egyptian government has frankly been so cautious because of the lives of those Egyptians. So I think degrading his military capability, keeping him under pressure so that he cannot disrupt what's going on in Tunisia and Egypt, send waves of immigrants to those countries and to southern Europe, including Italy, all of those things have merit and value on their own, in my view.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, if tomorrow a foreign nation intentionally, for whatever reason, launched a Tomahawk missile or its equivalent to New York City, would that be considered an act of war against the United States of America?
Probably so.
Then I assume the same result would be true and the same laws would apply and the same reasoning would apply if we launched a Tomahawk missile at another nation. Is that also true?
Well, you're getting into constitutional law here, and I'm no expert on it.
Mr. Secretary, you're Secretary of Defense. You ought to be an expert on what's an act of law, an act of war or not. if it's an act of war to launch a Tomahawk missile at New York City, would it not also be an act of war to launch that by us on another nation?
Presumably.
Mr. Secretary, a foreign leader recently made a statement, and I have a lot of respect for him, that the whole world looks like it's in an earthquake and everything is shaking. When you're in an earthquake, sometimes the only thing that keeps you from shaking is the rule of law. And many of us are very concerned about that. I listened today at some of the justifications for the rule of law here. I heard this word, well, this was okay because it's cover. There's nothing that cover does to change the rule of law. I heard that, well, we had a chance for success. There's nothing that success does to change the rule of law. I heard, well, this is a humanitarian crisis. That doesn't change the rule of law. Syria is a humanitarian crisis. Should they be scared to death, we're going to bomb them tomorrow. I heard that it was limited to scope and scale, which basically means a small war is okay, but a big one's not. Well, the difficulty is we have a hard time predicting the little ones from the big one. And then I heard it's okay to bomb the heck out of them as long as we say our goal is not regime change. Mr. Secretary, for the rule of law, we've got a very simple statute, the War Powers Act, which you said you were around when that was written. It doesn't require declaration of war. It requires one of three things, and I know you're familiar with them, but I'm just going to read them. It says our forces should not be put into hostilities or imminent hostilities by the Commander-in-Chief unless one of three things happen: a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack on the United States or its forces. My question for you today is, which of those three things took place to justify this act? Or if it didn't, is it the Administration's position, to the best of your knowledge, that they simply don't have to comply with the War Powers Act?
It has been the position of every President since the War Powers Act was passed that the kind of action that we have undertaken is compliant with law.
And Mr. Secretary, I'd like to just try one more time. Could you just tell me which of those three provisions, a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack on the United States or its forces, were applicable in this particular situation?
It has been the view of every President since the War Powers Act was passed that the kind of action we are taking is compliant with the law.
So in other words, once again on the rule of law, it's kind of like obscenity. We know it when we see it. We can't put these actions in one of those three categories. Therefore, the conclusion we have to reach is that the President just feels that he doesn't have to comply with the War Powers Act, and maybe that's what every single other President has felt as well. But I can just tell you, in this shaking time on the rule of law, it doesn't help us when we have these conclusions that the end justifies the means. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mrs. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for being here. This is a difficult time, obviously. There are so many activities going on around the world. We appreciate the fact that you're there. Mr. Secretary, I think that we all are often in a position of our words being used against us, and in this case, I think the comment that you made about our national interest is one that I wanted to give you an opportunity to clarify, even beyond the statement that you made in closing this morning. Could you please do that? And I think respond to the fact that this was obviously, I think, a reluctant move on our behalf, and I wanted to give you both perhaps an opportunity to even respond to that.
Well, I think that what happens in Libya is clearly in our interest. What happens in the Middle East is a vital interest. And Libya and what is going on in Libya, I think, has an impact on the rest of the region. And I think Gaddafi, unrestrained, could have had a very negative effect on the democratic revolutions that are taking place across the region. I think it's also important to bear in mind that our allies, particularly Britain and France, but a number of others, have come to our assistance in Afghanistan. They have put up 50,000 troops, nearly 50,000 troops, because we felt Afghanistan was in our vital interest. Britain and France and our other allies clearly believe that what's going on in Libya is a matter of vital interest for them. And so I think that one aspect of this that hasn't been touched on is that we are stepping up to help the same allies who have helped us in Afghanistan. They have now taken over the lead of this. I think this is consistent with Libya being in our interest because of our allies' interest in it, but also I think the vital importance of the region as a whole. And I think one of the things that differentiates this, we've been dealing with Gaddafi for over 40 years. I cannot recall a single instance in the last 40 years in which the Arab League has called for action against one of their own members. And so you have the Arab League, you have NATO, you have the United Nations, all expressing the view that action needed to be taken against this guy. And I think that this is an area where the United States is now receding to a supporting role, recognizing the strain on our resources and our men and women in uniform. And I think that comports with our interests.
I would only add, ma'am, that from the military perspective, it's not up to me or those of us in the military to define our national interests. It is up to us to defend them, and that's really what we do.
I would not necessarily get into a what-if game, but I also want you to, if you could respond to the possibility that Colonel Gaddafi could comply with UN demands. And I'm wondering whether the administration would want to accept the continued existence of his regime.
Well, I think that the political future in Libya needs ultimately to be decided by the Libyans themselves. The circumstances under which he would be allowed to remain are hard for me to imagine, but there are conditions that the President has put down in terms of a ceasefire that would include him withdrawing from the cities that he has occupied, restoring the utilities and so on, and stopping killing his own people. Everything that we've seen to this moment suggests that he's not in compliance with any of those things.
Is it possible that the rebels themselves would not respect a ceasefire, that they would want to continue giving a scenario that we don't see today where there is strength behind that effort?
Well, again, I just don't know the answer to that. I think that there are a lot of different diplomatic players involved, even now, with outreach from both the rebels and from various people in Gaddafi's camp, and what the outcome of those talks may be, I can't foresee at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, do you think it's time that there was some type of resolution, either judicial, and I guess it would have to be judicial, about this conflict on the War Powers Act between the legislature and the executive body?
I'm not going to wade into that, Mr. Miller. That's up to the Congress and up to the President.
Did I hear you say that the President would appreciate a vote on a resolution of support from this Congress on our nation's involvement in Libya?
That such a resolution would be welcome, yes.
Would you be willing to speculate what that vote would be?
No, sir.
Could you or Admiral Mullen discuss our plans, if any, regarding arming the rebels? They seem to be getting their butts whipped.
Well, consistent with what the Secretary said, we know a few of their leaders, but there's just a whole lot more we don't know. And so we certainly are looking at options from not doing it to doing it. There's a fairly standard way to do this, to train and equip, that we are familiar with. But I'd also repeat what the Secretary said. We're not the only ones that are familiar with this. There are plenty of countries who have the the ability, the arms, the skill set to be able to do this. And so that's in significant both discussion and debate right now, but heretofore no decision has been made to do that.
What would be the effect on current activities if we can't reach a budget resolution and this government were shut down?
Well, as I think we've indicated before to the committee, even under the continuing resolution, there are severe consequences already for the Department of Defense. There will essentially be no military construction for FY11. There are a number of acquisition programs. I
apologize, specifically Libya.
I'm sorry?
Specifically Libya. We're not building anything in Libya, I don't think.
Oh, I misunderstood your question.
Yeah, if the government were to shut down, what would the effect be on the activities we are currently involved in?
My understanding of the law is that it would not impact any current military operations.
Why did the President notify Congress quickly? You said the next day after he made the decision. What was his reasoning for notifying the Congress?
I think that it's consistent with the actions that I've seen of other presidents of wanting to inform the Congress of the leadership of the reasons for his action and to solicit their support.
And did he get it? Support?
There was not. I would say there was, other than one member who raised the War Powers Act issue, there really wasn't much discussion.
What support did he ask for from the Congress?
Simply, well, he wanted them to understand what he was doing and that there would be public support from the Congress.
We don't understand what he's doing still, and I don't think he has the support of this Congress, but that's my personal opinion. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll give you my assessment of a vote in Congress. It would be truly bipartisan on the yeas and the nays. I think that's kind of where this House is right now. There's a lot of folks on different sides of this issue in both parties. And the reason for this hearing is to get a better idea, try to settle some of those thoughts that folks are having. In the spirit of the social media revolution that set all this off in the Middle East, I actually tweeted last night telling people that you were going to be here and ask for some questions from folks, and actually got a good one, a good one back. It has to do with the opposition. It has to do with the idea that removal of Gaddafi will likely be achieved over time through political and economic measures and by his own people, from your testimony, Mr. Secretary. And a question that came back regarding that issue is how does a disparate opposition that is multi-headed or in some respects leaderless organize to defeat Gaddafi without additional help beyond what's being provided right now? If the military mission is just to protect the civilian population and to have enforce a no-fly zone, but you have this opposition that has many heads and no leaders, how do they organize? So the specific question I have with regards to that is, what specific steps are we taking to, are we directing to organize these rebels so that we help that objective, if that is one of the objectives in Libya?
Well, again, as I said earlier, part of the challenge here is that the opposition is, or the rebels are so disparate and so scattered. You know, the truth is that there was a certain point not too long ago when almost all the major cities in Libya were in the middle of uprisings. And there's very little indication of much coordination or contact among them. It was basically a spontaneous uprising in one city and town after another. And in many of them, they were able to either turn the Gaddafi military or chase them out of town. So the notion that the Libyan people can't do this, I think, is contradicted a bit by that earlier experience. As I said in response to another question, we really have very little insight into the very different pieces of this opposition, and one of the things that obviously needs to happen is for there to be some unity, but frankly, among them. But frankly, we have little means of doing that at this point.
And I think that's one of the concerns, is that does the rebellion have legs to it without a lot more help? And so we go through this military mission, and at the end of it, we still don't get the payoff, if you will.
Well, I think that the degradation of Gaddafi's military over time does create the circumstances that makes it easier for these people. I mean, we're blowing up his ammunition supplies. He can't resupply from abroad any of the things that have been lost. So it will be difficult for him to recuperate or to restore his military capabilities, and over time, that should work to the advantage of those in opposition.
So, it's my understanding that the administration has, I think the words have been used, has yet to make a decision on whether or not to arm the rebels. That is to sort of take advantage of the language of the UN resolution 1973. So, given that there's a decision yet to be made whether you do it or not, can you at least provide, what are the 3 or 4 top criteria the administration would use to make that decision?
Well, we haven't really addressed this issue, quite frankly, up until this point, and I would just share with you my view is this is something that a lot of other countries can do. And one of the things that I think makes Libya different in terms of what's going on there right now is that the United States is in support of others, and others have been taking a much more aggressive stance in that respect, if you will. And my view would be if there is going to be that kind of assistance to the opposition, there are plenty of sources for it other than the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, Admiral Mullen, for being here. I want to also acknowledge our men and women who are serving. We are also grateful to what they do to keep our country safe. And Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you, as others have, for your candor, because you're answering some very difficult and uncomfortable questions honestly and directly, and I appreciate that. I also want to associate myself with Mr. Forbes' comments concerning the approval process and congressional concern that the War Powers Act has not been complied with. And I want to also associate myself with Mr. Miller's comments that I do not believe that the only issue you're facing is an issue of lack of congressional approval. I think that there is significant question as to whether or not you have congressional support. I can tell you that I believe that if you placed a resolution on this floor today for a vote for approval, that I doubt that it would pass. And I certainly would not be voting for it. And I would not be voting for it, Mr. Secretary, because of the answer you gave us with your candor of who it is that we're supporting. This mission is unclear and the goals are unclear because, as your answer is, when we ask who are the rebels, you say, other than a handful, we don't have much visibility. And then you say, I'm not aware, I don't know. We don't know. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their position is with the United States. We don't know what they will do if they're successful. We don't know what form of government they will pursue. We don't know their geopolitical position with their neighbors, with NATO, or with us. Therefore, many of us are very concerned as to overall what would be the outcome here. And without us knowing the questions that you've answered honestly and with candor that we don't know, I think it's very difficult for anyone to say that they could believe that this outcome will be positive. And on one of those outcomes that I'm concerned about is what does it say from a policy basis? What does it say on a doctrine basis? And what does it say in the region? Could you please tell me how much consideration was given to the United States efforts for Iranian non-proliferation initiatives when this decision was made to go into Libya?
The consideration to Iranian
non-proliferation initiatives, our ongoing efforts with Iran on nuclear non-proliferation.
I can tell you that I haven't heard a single question in this hearing or in the briefing yesterday that wasn't debated intensively during the administration's deliberations on this. So I think all of the ramifications of potential action were addressed. But let me just add one more thing. We may not know much about the opposition.
Just a second. Before you do that, I really am very interested in what considerations on the issues of Iranian nuclear non-proliferation initiatives. You said everything was considered. What it was considered and how was it considered?
I think the judgment was that it would have that this action with respect to Libya would have essentially no impact with respect to the Iranian nuclear program.
Well, and here's my concern. I mean, as you know, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, Libya had commenced a nuclear program and weapons of mass destruction program. And as you know, they cooperated with the United States and delivered to us the assets of that program, participated in inspections, and had been cooperating with us on this issue. And my concern is, what does it say to Iran at this time as they look to our action and whether or not this would harden their regime and put their regime on a faster-paced effort for a nuclear weapons program?
My view is that in terms of what they want to try and achieve in their nuclear program, they're going about as fast as they can. And it's hard for me to imagine that regime being much harder than it already is.
Thank you. Your comments then about the rebels.
What I was going to say is we may not know much about the opposition or the rebels, but we know a great deal about Gaddafi. The Jersey barriers that first appeared here in Washington appeared not after 9/11, but in 1983, after we received a number of clandestine reports indicating that Gaddafi wanted to kill President Reagan. We then had the La Belle Disco attack that killed 12 American servicemen that Tripoli was responsible for. That led to the President Reagan's bombing of Libya. This guy has been a huge problem for the United States for a long time. And the reason the Arab League came together and the reason that the UN voted and the reason NATO has supported this is not because they know a lot about the opposition, but because they know a lot about Gaddafi. And they know what Gaddafi was not only going to do to his own people, but his potential for disrupting everything that's going on in the Middle East right now. So I think in the eyes of many of the participants in this coalition, this was more a preventive action to keep Gaddafi from pursuing his depredations as much as it was supporting the opposition.
Thank you. Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I also would like to welcome Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen. And at this time, Mr. Chairman, I wish to yield my time to the gentlelady from Hawaii, Ms. Hanabusan.
Gentlelady is recognized for 4 minutes, 45 seconds.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Congresswoman Bordallo. Secretary Gates, are you at liberty or do you know what it's going to cost us or what it has cost us to date, our actions in Libya?
Yes, through last Monday it was about $550 million, and going forward in the reduced role that we will be playing, we estimate the cost will be around $40 million a month.
You also mentioned the cost of Japan, and I think it was 19 ships that we have deployed and about 18,000 of our service personnel in the relief efforts, and that it also had to come out of a budget. Do you know how much that's costing us?
No.
Do you know if it's around the $500-some-odd million?
No, it's significantly less than
that. You also mentioned that you believe that the amounts would be covered out of the OCO budget. Is that correct?
No, I said that was my opinion, that this is a matter still under discussion with the White House and OMB.
But it is going to be coming out of somewhere in the defense budget?
That is, I would expect that to be the case.
And if there's no supplemental, just assume that, it would still come somewhere out of the defense budget that we're dealing with today, correct?
Probably.
And we've heard...
But if there's no OCO, we're also in big trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And we also know that time and time again, members of the Department of Defense have come forward and said the CR is just preventing you from making any kind of long-term determination or planning. So I'm now very curious about if it comes out of OCO, if the OCO goes through the way it is now, would you be able to cover these costs?
I think so, yes.
So, Secretary Gates, that causes somewhat of a problem in the sense that if we are cutting the budget or if the CRs have cut the budget as much as it can, I'm curious as to how you are going to now be able to accommodate a cost of $550 million and $40 million a month plus whatever Japan may be costing us out of that OCO budget that is supposed to already be cut pretty close to the bone. So how are you going to do that?
Because there's several $billion in there that was moved around principally by the Congress that we think we can recover, would cover these costs.
And when you say it was moved around by the Congress, are you saying that it's still within the budget itself and
Yes.
you just...
But things that we don't need or want.
Do you realize that as we're all looking for money, that to say that there's a couple of $1 billion out there that you don't need or want that the Congress is doing, it kind of leaves us to wonder, okay, where are they, so that if we have to cut, what are we going to cut?
Well, I think the Congress has already done that with the OCO.
Well, I realize that, but you're saying there's several $1 billion that you're still going to be able to cut, and you're going to be, well, it's not what you want, and that's how you're going to fund it.
No, I'm saying that we could substitute these costs for other costs that are in the OCO.
And what are those costs, Secretary?
Well, I'd have to get that for you for the record.
I really would appreciate that, because I would like to know what that is. You also said, and we've heard this constantly, that there will be no boots on the ground in terms of Libya. That's correct, right? Now, can you also tell me, at this present time, do our, quote, allies or the NATO forces or Operation, what's the new name now? It's, anyway, Unified Protector. Are there any boots on the ground at this time in Libya?
Not that I'm aware of.
So we're saying we're not going to put any boots on the ground, but neither have our allies.
That's my understanding. And to tell you the truth, the opposition has said they don't want any.
So is there any attempt, or do you know if there's any time in the future that there are going to be boots on the ground in Libya?
Not as long as I'm in this job.
I know that's on our side, but do you know if the Allied or
on the allies, I have no idea.
There's been no discussion as to when they would put boots on the ground? No?
I don't think so.
And under what conditions? So it could be that, though we're saying there's no boots on the ground, no one has any intention of putting boots on the ground, that it could just continue with this airstrike.
Well, as I indicated, the rebels themselves have said they don't want any.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen. I want to sort of dig into this NATO operation thing and see if we all agree and understand. We have a NATO operation in Afghanistan right now. Is that not correct? Isn't that what we have? And we have it's NATO plus about another 21 or 22 non-contributing. Exactly. But it's a NATO operation, and there are other contributing nations. And we have a commander, happens to be an American in this case, General Petraeus, running that, and he's got sort of an interesting chain of command. He's the central command, and General Mattis is involved in this, and I assume Admiral Stavridis involved in this, and there's a chain that comes up to you, Mr. Chairman, and you, Mr. Secretary. But it's essentially a NATO operation, and our NATO partners there have caveats.
I know, Mr. Secretary, and hearing after hearing, we all felt your frustration as you went and talked to the NATO allies in this NATO operation and said, you know, you've got to get rid of some of these caveats. We've got to get you out in the field. We've got to get you out of the wire and get you engaged and get you to contribute more. And as you said, Admiral, we have other nations who are not part of NATO who are involved there. And now we're involved in another NATO operation. We've turned over control of NATO as like that's somebody else. Those are other people. It's not us. But we're part of NATO, and we're supporting, in a supporting role here, but we're still part of NATO, and it's got in this case, this operation has a Canadian Lieutenant General who is commanding, but he's got a command structure, and presumably it goes to Admiral Stavridis again. And so I'm just a little bit hesitant to look at this as though we've turned this over to somebody else. We're now involved in a NATO operation, and there are countries with caveats, like, the United States has a caveat that we won't put boots on the ground. And I'm not being critical of that caveat. I'm just trying to put this in the context of what's going on here. This is a NATO operation. It involves the United States as part of NATO. NATO forces are involved in this, and NATO, our U.S. forces, have caveats on what we will and will not do. Is that roughly correct, either one of you?
I think, yes, sir. It is roughly, although the caveat issue, in particular with respect to ISAF, I mean, to a point that I don't even track them anymore because so many of them have been taken off the table by our NATO allies.
I understand.
Over time.
And I don't mean to interrupt, but I am on the clock, and I do appreciate, and I'm sure the Secretary appreciates, a lot of those caveats have gone away, and our NATO allies in Afghanistan are much more engaged than they were when the Secretary was sitting in front of this committee 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, or ever how many years ago it's been. But I just want to get this in the context that they're different operations, but they're both NATO. Our forces are involved. We're clearly heavily engaged in Afghanistan. We have the most forces. We're the most active. We have the fewest caveats and so forth. But our forces are involved here as well. And when we say we've turned this over, that's just a little bit misleading. We're still part of this operation. A NATO operation doesn't mean it's some foreign operation. This is a command structure which we're not only an integral part of, but we're the leaders of.
We clearly are integral to this, but what the Secretary said and what I said is we really are in support here. So the staffs are much more integrated with NATO, individuals from NATO countries.
But if I could, we're not supporting somebody else. We're part of this.
We're supporting.
We have a smaller role than we had until this morning, but we're still part of a NATO force. And I want to put it in that context because whoever's flying the planes that are releasing the munitions to destroy tanks and Gaddafi forces and degrade his army and so forth, we're still part of that force. And so I'm trying to get at the mission piece of this, and I'm not going to have any time to do it, but very quickly I want to ask this question. If you look at a city like Sirte, where you didn't really have this humanitarian crisis, it's Gaddafi's hometown. As far as we know, there weren't protests there. If the rebel forces move into Sirte, or trying to get into Sirte, and Gaddafi's forces are just trying to keep them out, is this part of a humanitarian role, or what would be the justification for NATO forces, of which we're a part, for striking Gaddafi's forces there?
I think the civilian protection mission is dominant there. However,
but Gaddafi's forces aren't killing civilians.
However, there has been also a primacy issue on no civilian casualties, or absolutely minimizing them, and that applies to NATO as well as it did to us up to this point.
Thank you. Ms. Tsongas.
I want to thank you both for being here. I don't think when last you were before us we imagined you'd be back quite so soon. So thank you again for appearing with and answering the many difficult questions that we continue to have. I think we were all very pleased that the President, in speaking to the American people, clarified what his intentions were and what the rationale was. And I think also we can all feel good steps were taken in bringing the international community and our Arab partners into this process. And as always, I think we've seen how admirably our men and women in uniform have performed. But I want to revisit the question of boots on the ground. I appreciate so much, Secretary Gates, your firm commitment and continued reiteration that that is not something that you would find acceptable. And I myself want to take this opportunity to say that I could not, under any circumstances, support the deployment of U.S. ground forces to Libya. But I worry that we have a stalemate on our hands, and we are already seeing the limit of what can be done from the air. And numerous reports have indicated that within the just past 2 or 3 weeks, that President Obama has signed a covert finding which would authorize military aid to the Libyan rebels. To me, this signals that other options besides the current arms embargo, no-fly zone, and airstrikes are being left on the table. With 2 other wars, as you both have said, and our armed forces nearly at the breaking point after a decade of combat, deployment of our ground forces into Libya cannot be one of them. Secretary Gates, it's my understanding that Admiral Gortney, Director of the Joint Staff, has indicated that the United States believes it has the authority to put forces on the ground in Libya. Can you envision any scenario in which the rebel forces, you've said that they don't want us at this point, but a scenario in which they would request a presence of U.S. or coalition ground forces in Libya, and under what circumstances would we consider such a request?
I assume there are conditions under which they would ask for it. I cannot imagine the circumstances under which the President would approve it.
So you think that it's an absolute line in the sand that U.S. troops, the boots would never be on the ground?
That is certainly the way he has expressed it to the Chairman and myself.
And going forward, as we transition to NATO, and if NATO were to make a decision that it needed to put boots on the ground, would there be a caveat in place that said no American soldiers could be used in that context?
Presumably.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this morning. We don't know much about the rebels. I wonder what we do know about Gaddafi's advisors. Do we have any intelligence as to who his military advisors are and what their current status might be as to remaining loyal to him? It seems like the best way for him to come out of power if somebody close to him takes that into their own hands. Do we have any intelligence to that effect?
I think we do have information about some of those in his inner circle, but in terms of their intentions, I think we don't have much. What we do have is the evidence of one of his intimates, his foreign minister, defecting yesterday, right? Which was somebody very much in his inner circle, and so frankly an encouraging sign.
You've said several times that there are other entities around the world that are capable of training and equipping Gaddafi's rebel forces. I suspect the rebel forces just really want the equip part, not necessarily about the training part, because that will require boots on the ground to do that. Comments this morning in the press about at least one attempt to fire an RPG, and they had it pointed the wrong direction, and so apparently a lot of training needs to go on with what they get. Since we don't know who the rebels are, and you don't really want to give weapons to folks that might misuse them somewhere else, if someone else decided to arm these rebels, what would our position be with respect to that?
Well, we really haven't.
What if it was Al-Qaeda decided to whistle in there and arm these guys?
Well, we would clearly have a problem with that. But if I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to the question.
Well, personally, I think arming those guys is a bad idea, but because we don't know who they are. We're doing it under this rubric of protecting civilians. Wouldn't we need to arm every single civilian in order to do that, to protect all the civilians?
I don't know.
I don't know. Not to put a too fine a line on this boots on the ground thing. We've had boots on the ground in Libya. We had those 2 pilots that came out of the air, and the search and rescue mission that is a part of the unique capabilities. So we will have folks on the ground in Libya from time to time if necessary in order to fulfill those missions. Is that correct?
Only for a search and rescue mission.
But they'll be there in harm's way to do that?
Very briefly.
Okay. Admiral Mullen, I hate saying these kinds of things, but you made a brag earlier about the way the coalition was put together, the international community, the Arab League, and went quite extensive in that brag. It's odd that we didn't have the time to solicit Congress's intervention or help in that regard. And again, that's just folks on this side of the table whining about the process. But you did say that, and I wanted to push back on that just a little bit. 40 years of a dictatorship doesn't create in place the kind of civilian mechanisms for running a country. If Gaddafi does come out of power, tribal nature of the communities, what do you envision that process looking like, since there is no organized military leadership in place and there doesn't appear to be anyone we know of on the civilian side? What really are the prospects for a Libya emerging from this regime change in anything that's remotely orderly?
Well, I think that there are several alternative outcomes. One is that somebody from his military takes him out and then cuts a deal with the opposition. So that would be one scenario. Another scenario would be the tribes abandon him and then cut their own deals with each other. Another alternative would be clearly our preferred option, which would be that these opposition forces and the tribes come together and begin to create something that resembles a more democratic state that protects the rights of its people. So there are a number of different possible outcomes to this.
Do you see what would be our involvement under any of those scenarios?
Well, I think our involvement, if asked, would probably be the most likely under one in which they were moving toward a more democratic government.
And we have any kind of a criteria?
We don't really have any influence or particular sway with the tribes, as an example.
I understand that. Have we put any kind of a metric in place as to decide, assuming some government does emerge, which ones we will which would support versus which one we would not?
No, we haven't gone that far yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You go back.
Thank you. Mrs. Castor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for being here this morning. I'd like you to give us an inventory of Gaddafi's military forces and assets, and first take a step back. Libya is a country of about 6.5 million in population. Generally, do we have an idea on, if you take that 6.5 million, how many in the population are loyal to Gaddafi and how many oppose the regime?
Let me take a shot at the second part first and come back to the military piece. And it goes to part of the discussion that just occurred. What we're seeing on the tribal side is actually, I would call it hedging, that even inside tribes, even inside Gaddafi's own tribe, there is a split on where this is going. And I guess my experience is, in taking this to other countries, is that's not uncommon. The people kind of want to see how this is going to come out before they vote, particularly if he is sustained and given his track record for killing as many of his own citizens as he possibly can. With respect to his military, 15 to 20,000, he centers the most capable military on the 32nd Brigade, which one of his sons commands. It is predominantly in the Tripoli area, although not exclusively. There's another brigade called the 9th Brigade. So we have a pretty good feel for his center of gravity and his military capability. And as I indicated earlier, we've attrited the vast majority of his air defenses.
You said 20 to 25%?
About 20 to 25%. No, overall of his military capability. Mm-hmm. But the vast majority of his air defenses are gone. He does have some mobile
inventory for us, what his capabilities and firepower are in the air, and
he doesn't have much in the air left. I mean, in terms of, we just haven't seen any. We've seen, I think, one plane fly since since the no-fly zone was effectively in place, which was very rapidly after the initial setting of that zone. He's got a significant amount of capability with respect to tanks, armored personnel carriers.
Do you know how many? Can you?
Well, I'd rather put it in roughly the ratio. He's about a 10-to-1 ratio for him versus for the regime forces versus the opposition. So he's got the mobility, he's got the training, he's got command and control communications, a lot of which the opposition just doesn't have.
And probably very little in the water.
Now, he's got some capability in the water, but it's tied up, and they know if they move, they're not going to move again. And that message has been communicated to him. So most of his capability is ground capability, and over time, that will continue to be able to be attritted depending on where it is. I don't expect we would do that in town. That's the civilian casualty piece, but certainly in proximity, as has been the case in the last few
And
days.
over the past decade, where has Gaddafi purchased his weaponry? If apparently his strength is in the tanks and land vehicles, or even in the air, where has he purchased his capability?
He's got an awful lot of former Soviet Union capability.
Any Western countries that you know of?
I just don't know.
And then how could you talk a little bit about the rebels' capability? You said they're disparate, scattered, they lack command and control. How many militarily trained rebels would you
The
estimate?
estimate is about 1,000 that we have right now. But again, as the Secretary said, that's our understanding is that's principally in the east, and so we just don't know across the land how many would stand up at this point.
You don't have a good feel for who would join the fight or who has joined the fight, and how many you could put into that resistance population?
Well, they are supplemented by a fair number of civilians who don't have a military background.
Right. Do you know? Can you say how many thousands or not?
No.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, thank you for joining us today, and thank you so much for your service. I want to begin by stating what the Obama administration has said, and that is their effort is to persuade Gaddafi to relinquish power. Under that scenario, what happens if Gaddafi stays in power? And if he does, what's the contingency plan if he continues in that role?
I think we have considered the possibility of this being a stalemate and being a drawn-out affair. It's hard for me to, unless there's some kind of a significant change in behavior in terms of his own people and so on, it's hard for me to imagine circumstances in which we would be content to deal or tolerate a government that still had Gaddafi at its head. And I think it's hard to forecast what directions this business may take. But I think that the administration would have a hard time accepting a government with Gaddafi as the head in terms of dealing with it.
Okay. So at this point, though, there's no contingency plan if he does continue to remain in power?
Other than keeping the pressure on.
Okay. And the administration has said, too, that absolutely not going to deploy ground forces there. But as we've watched 10 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq and know that as we pursue operations there with precision strike and the use of air power, we talk about that being used to prepare the battle space and that coordinated effort there. Under that scenario, is it correct that we have nobody on the ground in Libya in any way, shape, or form directing or coordinating these airstrikes like we have used tactically in Iraq and Afghanistan?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you satisfied with the effectiveness of that, then, without us being able to direct those operations like we do in other theaters?
The Chairman's better able to speak to that than I am. I think there's some, loss with not having somebody on the ground, but I think that It's more than offset by the effectiveness of what we are doing and by not having anybody there.
I want to talk a little bit, too, about the no-fly zone and looking at deployment of a Marine Expeditionary Unit there in the Mediterranean and looking at how the Sixth Fleet is currently being deployed. The UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and 1970 requires inspection of all vessels and aircraft en route to and from Libya if there's a reason to believe that the cargo contains items that are prohibited in Resolution 1970. Under that scenario, what role do you see the U.S. Navy and the Marine Corps assuming in that area, enforcing those elements of the UN Resolution 1973 and 1970?
I would see it, again, NATO's part of the mission that NATO's assumed is the arms embargo. So we would certainly support it in terms of ships that would be under the NATO chain of command to support that. And I would also note that this particular resolution is the first one that I'm aware of that allows us to actually do this at sea, to board whether we're invited or not. And that's a significant upgrade, if you will, of being able to enforce something like the arms embargo.
Will that stretch our force capacity as far as our naval forces, especially with where we need them elsewhere with, say, the Fifth Fleet and now engaging the Sixth Fleet in an expanded role?
Well, no, sir. I don't think substantially. In addition to focus on Libya, this is a part of the world that also has a significant amount of turmoil throughout it. So having a presence of naval capability there in the Mediterranean, I think, is a wise decision.
Looking at these scenarios, it's great to have that ability to board these vessels at sea, but let's face it, there's also a contingency that some of them get ashore and some of these materials get ashore. What would be the U.S. role if we were to find that out, that under this resolution there was a violation with these supplies going ashore?
Well, I don't know if the implication of the question is would we go ashore. The answer would be no. I mean, it is, and this question has come up a lot, I mean, it's zero boots on the ground, none, with respect to that. I actually have a reasonable amount of confidence, certainly from the arms embargo standpoint, that we can enforce this in a way that is maybe not exactly perfect, but it's a very strong embargo that we might be, I think we're going to be able to significantly impact his ability to break it, although that certainly is a possibility as well.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Gates, Admiral Mullen, thank you for your service, and above all, thanks to our troops. I have more of a statement than a question, because my remarks have to deal more with the Congressional role in this process. I don't think it's been mentioned so far here today that the Senate, the U.S. Senate, on March 1st, unanimously called for a no-fly zone over Libya. The House did not have a similar action, but that's at least some sign of Congressional involvement early on in this process. It's no secret that this is a period of domestic tension in this country politically, but it makes me yearn for the days when politics stopped at the water's edge and we could gather behind the Commander-in-Chief. There's been a lot of discussion about the War Powers Act. From some members here, they're still unfamiliar with it. As you pointed out, Mr. Secretary, every single president, Democrat or Republican, has questioned the constitutionality of that act. If we had wanted to repair it, we've had years to do so. But Congress has not done that. There's a school of thought in the law that although the War Powers Act was intended to limit presidential power, it has in fact expanded it. Yet we in Congress have not amended that act since 1973. Many people have wondered about the lack of adequate notice to this body. Well, the leadership in each party was informed promptly after the President's decision. So perhaps we should question our own contact with our own party leadership. But that has not been raised, at least so far in this hearing. I also think that you can see the President's age, Democrat or Republican. For almost every year in office, they age about 10 years, it seems like. The gray hair, the white hair quickly comes. They carry the weight of the world on their shoulders. They are privy to many things that we cannot discuss here in open hearing. And I'm all for Congress. We are an equal branch. But sometimes we do not take our responsibilities equally seriously with the chief executive of the land. And that worries me, because Congress should be more than a Congress of backseat drivers, more than a Congress of armchair generals. You gentlemen have conducted your responsibilities ably and well under difficult circumstances. I worry that we in this body have not. So I'm hopeful that on a going forward basis we can examine some of these things. Not having declared a war since World War II. Vietnam was not a war. Korea was not a war. So many of these other countries. We need to get our act together in this body. And this is not a criticism of you. You gentlemen in the executive branch are doing ably and well. We need to get our act together in the legislative branch. So thank you for your service. Above all, thanks to our troops. But I think in the interest of full disclosure in this hearing, we need to reflect on congressional shortcomings as well. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your service, and also thanks to the service of our men and women in uniform. When, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Chairman, can you tell me when it was clearly communicated to Muammar Gaddafi that if in fact you do these things that create the humanitarian crisis that you described, that we will in fact intervene militarily to degrade your capability and to stop this humanitarian catastrophe from happening? As we assembled these forces, to include predominantly our own, when did we clearly communicate those conditions, and what specifically were those conditions, so that if he ceased his activities in terms of again, attacking civilian targets, that in fact our forces would not intervene?
Well, first of all, he should have seen this coming, beginning with the Gulf Cooperation Council resolution, then the Arab League resolution. So he and